Long ago and far away, in enchanted lands across the seas, lived kings and queens, princes and princesses, good fairies and wicked witches, ferocious giants and gentle dwarfs. Their adventures and stories have been told for hundreds of years. Open the pages and listen to the words, and you too can join the magical world of Once Upon a Time. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Once upon a time, there was a happy kingdom, ruled by a courageous king and a beautiful and kind queen. One day, the queen was sitting by her window sewing, while outside the snow was falling. Carelessly, the queen pricked her finger, and a drop of blood fell onto the snow on the windowsill. Oh, how I would like to have a baby girl, with hair as black as this ebony thimble, skin as white as snow, and lips as red as blood, she thought. Before a year had passed, the queen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, with hair the colour of ebony, perfect skin, and blood-red lips, and she called her Snow White. Unfortunately, not long after the little girl was born, the queen died. The king was very sad, but he decided to marry again. He chose a beautiful woman, but she was so vain she couldn't bear to think there was anyone more beautiful. The new queen had a magic mirror, which a very powerful fairy had given to her. Every morning, after dressing herself up from top to toe, she would ask it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And every morning the mirror would reply, "You, O Queen, are fair and lovely too. In all the land there is none as beautiful as you." The queen knew the mirror never lied, so she was happy. In the meantime, Snow White was growing up and becoming more beautiful every day. Then one morning, the mirror replied to the queen, "You, O Queen, are fair and lovely too, but there is someone 1,000 times more beautiful than you." The queen ordered the mirror to name the hateful rival. When she discovered it was her stepdaughter Snow White, she was furious. The thought that her beauty was being obscured made the queen mad with jealousy. The queen shut herself in her chambers and plotted. Snow White had to die. She called a huntsman and gave him his orders. "Take Snow White into the forest and kill her. As proof of her death, you will bring me her heart and her liver. Do not disobey me, or you will pay for it with your life." The huntsman led Snow White into the thick of the forest. But while they were walking, he could not help noticing how the young girl smiled happily at the birds and squirrels, and he could not help hearing her beautiful silvery singing. He was spellbound by her beauty. Nevertheless, the queen had given him his orders. He took his knife out of its sheath and raised his arm to strike, but Snow White turned to him with her eyes brimming with tears. "Don't kill me," she said. "I have done you no harm." The huntsman lowered his arm and told Snow White that he was only doing what the queen had ordered. "I don't have the heart to kill you," he said, "but you must promise me that you will hide in the wildest part of the forest and never return home. Otherwise I will pay with my life." Snow White promised. On his way back to the castle, the huntsman killed a fawn and took its heart and liver to give to the queen. Meanwhile, poor Snow White wandered alone through the forest. She was reeling from tiredness and hunger when she spotted a strange little house with tiny windows and doors. She knocked, but no one answered, so she pushed open the door and went in. Inside, everything was spick and span and orderly, but all the things in the house were surprisingly tiny. There was a tiny little table laid with a white tablecloth. On top, there were 7 little plates, spoons and mugs. In the next room, there were 7 little beds. Snow White was too tired to wonder who they belonged to. She went back to the table and ate a morsel from each of the 7 little plates and took a sip of wine from each of the mugs. Then she lay down on one of the little beds and fell fast asleep. 1 hour later, the owners of the house returned. They were 7 dwarfs who went digging in the depths of the mountain for precious stones. They lit their lanterns and quickly realized their things had been disturbed. Someone had been in their home. The first said,
"Who has sat on my chair?
and the second,
Who has eaten from my plate?
and the third,
Who has taken a piece of my bread?
and the fourth,
Who has rumpled my napkin?
and the fifth,
Who has used my little fork?
and the sixth,
Who has cut with my little knife?
and the seventh."
Who has drunk from my little glass?"
Then all together they headed for the bedroom. When they saw Snow White sleeping deeply, they were speechless with amazement. Never had they seen such a beautiful young girl.
"Now what shall we do?"
Said one of the little dwarfs.
"Poor little girl, she seems very tired.
Noticed another.
Let's leave her sleeping."
But with these whispers, Snow White awoke. At first she thought she was dreaming. But then the first dwarf said,
"What's your name?"
and the second,
Where do you come from?
and the third.
Where did you come into our little house?"
Snow White sat up. "My name is Snow White, and I'm the daughter of the king," she told them. "I came in because I did not know where to rest for the night."
Couldn't you return to the castle?"
asked one surprised dwarf. On hearing these words, Snow White burst into tears and told her sad tale. The dwarfs were really shocked when they heard the evil intentions of Snow White's stepmother.
"Why don't you stay and live with us?"
Said the oldest dwarf.
"Right.
Said the second.
You could look after the house while we're away. You could get a hot meal ready for when we come home.
Said the third hopefully.
And keep us company in the evenings.
Said the fourth.
Here, with us, you'll be happy."
The fifth assured her.
"Yes,
Said the sixth.
we're a little grumpy sometimes, but we'll love you. Only, watch out for your stepmother.
The seventh advised her.
Remember not to let anyone in."
The days passed happily. Snow White made breakfast for the dwarfs and then waved them off to work and got on with her tiny chores. Meanwhile, in the royal palace, her evil stepmother lived happily, certain that she was again the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. But then one morning she questioned the mirror and it replied, "Here in the castle your beauty is unmatched, but deep in the forest lives the fairest maid in all the land." The queen realized the huntsman had tricked her and that Snow White was still alive. Shaking with anger, she decided to resort to the magic powers which had been given to her by the powerful fairy who had given her the mirror. She changed herself into a hunched and wrinkled old woman and went to the house of the 7 dwarfs. When she was close by, she started to shout, "Beautiful wares, wares to buy!" Snow White, who suspected nothing, approached the hunched old woman. "Look at these beautiful ribbons, my child," said the old woman. "I have just the one to suit you perfectly." She placed the ribbon around Snow White's waist and pulled so tightly that the young girl fell to the ground as if she were dead. That evening, the 7 dwarfs came home and found Snow White lying on the grass, so still they thought she must be dead. They lifted her up, and when they saw the ribbon they cut it quickly, and Snow White came to life. She told them what had happened.
"That old woman was none other than your stepmother,"
they exclaimed.
"We told you not to trust anyone."
In the meantime, having just reached the castle, the queen hurried to question her mirror, which replied, Here in the castle, O Queen, your beauty is unmatched. But deep in the forest lives the fairest maid in all the land. The Queen was livid with rage, but immediately came up with another evil trick. She disguised herself as an old widow and poisoned a comb. She walked up to the home of the 7 dwarfs and tricked Snow White into opening the door. "Oh, I am alone in the world," she said, "and I haven't eaten in 3 days." Snow White gave her something to eat and drink, and even suggested that she rest there, but the widow refused. "I must go," she said, "but let me give you a present." Snow White did not want to accept, but the old widow insisted. "You have been so good to me that I want to give you this comb as a present. Allow me to place it in your hair." Snow White lowered her head, and the malicious woman drove it into her hair with all her might. When the dwarfs returned home, they found her lying unconscious on the ground. They hurried to revive her, and when they saw the comb, they took it out and threw it away. Snow White opened her eyes, and the dwarfs were quick to warn her again about her evil stepmother. Meanwhile, the Queen had returned to the palace, and feeling satisfied, questioned the magic mirror, which replied, "Here in the castle, O Queen, your beauty is unmatched, but deep in the forest lives the fairest maid in all the land." This reply infuriated the Queen. She swore to herself that Snow White would die. She withdrew into a secret room and prepared a potion of toad's legs and unicorn's nails, scorpion's tails, and rat's ears, which she boiled for hours. When it was ready, she took a beautiful red and green apple and dipped the red side into the potion. Then the Queen dressed up as a beggar and set off for the dwarf's house. Along the way, she rubbed her hands in glee. Nobody would be able to survive such a potent poison. When she was in sight of the house, she started to shout, "Apples! Beautiful apples!" Snow White came up to the window and told her that she couldn't open the door because the 7 dwarfs had forbidden her to. But the witch did not give up. "That doesn't matter," she said. "I only want you to try one of my apples. They're delicious and don't cost anything." "Thank you," said Snow White, "but the dwarfs have forbidden me to accept anything from anyone." The old woman smiled. "Oh, 1 apple has never done anyone any harm," she said. "What are you afraid of? Are you afraid it might be poisoned? Look, to reassure you, I will also eat a bit." And she bit into the green part. Then she offered the red part to Snow White. "Courage, little girl. Can't you smell how sweet it is?" "What can I fear of such a good old woman?" Snow White thought, and took the apple. But as soon as she put the poisoned apple to her lips, she fell to the ground, dead. The evil stepmother was glowing from her victory. "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. Yes, truly beautiful Snow White. Ha 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 ha," she cackled. "But this time the dwarfs will not be able to bring you back to life." And with a sneer, she left. As soon as she reached the castle, the Queen hurried to question the mirror, and this time the mirror replied, "You, O Queen, are fair and lovely too. In all the land there is none as beautiful as you." The wicked Queen was triumphant, but she had one more task. She summoned the disobedient huntsman and ordered him to leave the castle forever. Back in the forest, the 7 dwarfs returned home after their work and found Snow White collapsed on the floor. They tried all the remedies they knew, but this time there was no means of bringing her back to life. They took her in their arms and laid her on a little bed. All 7 knelt down and wept for 3 days and 3 nights. They decided to bury her in an oak coffin studded with diamonds, which they had collected from their mine. But when they saw that after 3 days Snow White was even more beautiful than before, her skin snow white and her hair shining ebony, they built a crystal case instead, and on the top they wrote her name in golden letters. They carried the case to the most beautiful and sunny glade in the whole forest, and every evening they went to find her there. They knelt by her and wept quietly. A long time passed, and Snow White continued to lie in her crystal coffin. She seemed as if she had fallen into a deep sleep. One day, a young prince rode by. Noticing the coffin of crystal, he stopped and read the inscription. On seeing the beautiful young girl, he fell hopelessly in love and remained there the whole day, kneeling by her side. When evening came, the 7 dwarfs came into the clearing and saw the young prince in tears. They told him that Snow White was the daughter of a king, and that she had been poisoned by her evil stepmother. "I want to carry her away with me," said the prince. But the dwarfs wouldn't be separated from Snow White for anything in the world. "I beg you," pleaded the prince. "I feel that I cannot live without her. I will protect her. I will honor her as she deserves, and I will love her for the rest of my life." When the dwarfs realized what the prince's feelings were, they granted his wish. The prince ordered that she be carried carefully by his men, and a procession was formed by the dwarfs and all the animals of the forest. But on the way, one of the servants tripped on a root and lost his balance. With the jolt, the piece of poisoned apple that Snow White still had in her throat fell out, and very slowly she opened her eyes. "Oh, where am I?" she asked. The prince took her hand and kissed her. Then he told her of his great love for her and explained how he had found her in her crystal case in the forest. He also told her that he would like to take her as his wife and asked her to go with him now to the grand castle where the king, his father, lived. The 7 dwarfs and all the animals were overjoyed that Snow White was alive, and they waved goodbye with tears in their eyes. Snow White promised that she would return often to visit them in the forest. The wedding was celebrated with great pomp, and by chance, Snow White's stepmother was invited too. The moment she recognized the beautiful bride, she was so overcome by rage that she died on the spot. But Snow White and her prince lived happily ever after.